Chairman of Ways and Means.
Order. Before I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, it may be for the convenience of honourable members if I remind them that at the end of the Chancellor's speech, copies of the budget resolutions will be available to them in the vote office. Mr. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, today's budget will continue to help people through this global recession and prepare Britain for the opportunities of the future. Firstly, there will be help now to get people back into work quickly and to support businesses and homeowners facing problems. And secondly, there will be measures to support investment in growth and green industries of the future whilst the recovery takes hold and ensure that our public finances are sustainable. We will protect investment in schools and hospitals and other key public services, and we will work to rebuild our financial services. And taken together, this budget will build on the strengths of the British economy and its people, speed the recovery, providing jobs and spreading prosperity. And in all of these decisions, we've been guided by our core values of fairness and opportunity and our determination to invest and grow our way out of recession. Mr. Deputy Speaker, today's budget will take Britain through the most serious global economic turmoil for over 60 years. The impact is being felt in every continent, every country, every community. When the world economy was plunged into a deep crisis in the 1930s, the response, both nationally and internationally, was too little and it was too late. And that failure to act turned a serious downturn into a prolonged depression. We will not repeat those mistakes again. This time, we and other countries have worked to avoid them. Across the globe, we have seen decisive action by national governments and internationally too. And this action, taken promptly and decisively, gives us good grounds for confidence. Mr. Deputy Speaker, today's budget builds on the substantial help for people and businesses that I announced in the pre-budget report last November. It builds on the steps we have taken to recapitalise and restore confidence in our financial institutions. And it builds on the outcome of the G20 summit in London this month, when the world's leading economies came together to agree an unprecedented coordinated action to speed global recovery. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the action already taken here and internationally, and the measures that I will announce today, mean that I expect the economy to start growing again towards the end of this year. And I'm also confident that as the global economy recovers to double in size over the next 20 years, Britain can and will be a world leader, and this budget will help make sure that we seize this opportunity. Mr. Deputy Speaker, as I told the House in November, we and other countries have been battling against a succession of shocks which have hit the world economy. At the end of 2007, problems in the international mortgage markets began to put a damaging squeeze on credit. In early 2008, we also saw dramatic volatility in many commodities prices, adding to uncertainty and putting pressure on growth. And last autumn, the dramatic failure of one of the top investment banks in America, Lehman Brothers, shattered an already fragile confidence and brought the international financial system to its knees. Since then, an extraordinary international financial crisis has fed into the wider economy, causing a steep and widespread world recession. And a crisis that started in the developed economies has spread to emerging and developing countries too. Industrial production has fallen, unemployment is rising by 5 million in the United States alone, and in the last few months, world trade fell. And whilst our exports are down 14%, exports in Germany are down 21%, in China 26%, and in Japan 45%. So for the first time since the Second World War, the world economy is expected to contract this year. In the last few months, we have seen considerable economic uncertainty, and that has fully justified the action that we and other countries have taken to support businesses and to support people. Since the autumn, we have put the banks on a stronger footing, cleaning up their balance sheets and helping boost bank lending. And as a result, banks will be able to lend billions of pounds more this year and next to home buyers and to businesses. Because getting credit flowing again is the essential precondition to economic recovery. Now, in the pre-budget report, I announced a range of measures to help the country through the recession, putting £20 billion back into the economy. And that help is coming through now, from an income tax cut and a VAT reduction which will continue until December. There is increased support for pensioners, as well as investment in vital public services and accelerated capital projects, which is protecting thousands of jobs in this country. And because of the reforms we have made to the welfare system since 1997, this comes on top of extra help when families need it most. I fully understand the anxiety behind calls to support those whose wages have fallen. But this is exactly the support that our flexible system can and is already offering. As shorter working weeks or irregular patterns reduce wages, those receiving tax credits can see an automatic increase to compensate for the loss of income. In March alone, for example, 355,000 families were receiving on average £35 a week more to support them through tax credits. All the more reason why we need to keep tax credits and not scrap them. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this demonstrates how our welfare system automatically helps people when they need it most. Fiscal support has been complemented too with sharp reductions in interest rates by central banks right across the world. The Bank of England interest rate is now down to 0.5%, the lowest it's ever been, and that has reduced the cost of mortgages and loans. The average saving since October for the 4.5 million families with tracker mortgages is over £230 a month. And we've now given the Bank of England new means to support the flow of credit and put money into the economy. Inflation has come down, which means people's incomes will go further. Mr. Deputy Speaker, taken together, the total support we have provided to the United Kingdom economy is expected to protect up to 500,000 jobs. And other governments across the world have been doing the same. The total amount of fiscal support across the G20 will amount to over $5 trillion. And, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there's also been unprecedented coordinated action at an international level. The G20 group of economies came together first in November and then in London earlier this month to fight this global recession. And we agreed to take whatever action was necessary to deliver the IMF forecast of global growth of over 2% by the end of next year. In total, we agreed over $1 trillion of additional support to the world economy. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are no quick fixes. There is no overnight solution. But because of the progress we've made here and internationally, we can begin to restore confidence, to save jobs and bring the world economy more quickly out of recession. Now, of course, we must make sure we deliver on these agreements, and starting at the meeting of finance ministers in Washington this week. And I want the next meeting of European Union finance ministers to be focused on rebuilding growth in Europe based on the foundations laid by the G20 in London. But we also need a clear path to recovery here, both fiscally and by investing to build in Britain's future. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the United Kingdom went into this global recession with employment at an all-time high, inflation, public debt and interest rates at low levels. But no country can insulate itself from the worldwide downturn. The position here, as in every country, has deteriorated in the autumn. In the last few months, world trade fell at the sharpest rate since 1945. And as an open economy, we are the world's 6th biggest export of goods and the 2nd largest export of services. We are affected by the collapse in demand in other countries. The unexpected severity of the recession has led the IMF to downgrade its own forecasts for the world economy 3 times since October. We, as well as other countries, as diverse as Japan, France, India and the United States, have reduced our growth estimates. Mr Deputy Speaker, the United Kingdom economy contracted by 1.6% in the last quarter of 2008. And for the first quarter of this year, I expect the economy will again contract by a similar amount. And my forecast for GDP growth for the year as a whole will be minus 3.5%, in line with other independent forecasts. But because, Mr Deputy Speaker, of our underlying strength, the measures we are taking domestically and internationally, I expect to see growth resume towards the end of the year. The IMF forecasts published today confirm that the problems that all countries will face this year. But they also show that the British economy will suffer less than Germany, less than Japan, less than Italy, and less than the euro area as a whole this year. The British economy, Mr Deputy Speaker, is diverse, it is flexible, and it is resilient, which is why I believe we can be confident in recovery. Next year, because of the pickup in world demand and the continuing benefit of lower prices and the substantial recovery measures being put in place, I'm forecasting growth of 1.25% in 2010. In future, the sources of our growth will be more varied, and we need to ensure that we play to our country's strengths. It will increasingly come from an expansion in investment by businesses in the industries of the future, such as low carbon, advanced manufacturing and communications. And these industries together are as important to the British economy as the financial services sector. And that's why it's been so important that we've increased, for example, investment in Britain's science base by 88% in real terms over the last 10 years. Growth will also be driven by the opportunities to export as the global economy doubles in size in the next 2 decades. From 2011, I am forecasting the economy will continue to recover, with growth of 3.5% from then on. To account for the impact of the global shock, I have further adjusted trend output on the productive potential of the economy. But in future years, the economy will recover towards a trend rate of growth of 2.75%. Inflation, Mr Deputy Speaker, is expected to continue coming down sharply, reaching 1% by the end of this year. And I'm writing to the Governor of the Bank of England in the usual way to confirm that the inflation target remains unchanged at 2%. The retail price index inflation is forecast to remain negative, falling to minus 3% by September, before moving back to zero next year. Mr Deputy Speaker, the deepening global recession has had an impact on the public finances here and in every country across the world. And in this budget, I will set out steps to ensure that they are on a sustainable path. And due to the measures that I will announce today, the current deficit is expected to halve within 4 years. But before I turn to that, I want to set out the additional help we will give to people and businesses to get through the recession and build towards recovery. Mr Deputy Speaker, we know from previous recessions that people's greatest fear is the loss of their job and their family home. All over the world, as the economy slows, unemployment is rising. In the UK, claimant count increased in February by 137,000. Today's figures show that in March it went up by 74,000, making the total claimant unemployment rate 4.5%. Now, it's not in any government's power to prevent all job losses. And even when the recovery is underway, it'll take time for unemployment to start falling. But governments must give people targeted help to find a new job as quickly as possible, and where necessary, to gain the new skills which will allow them to do this. This isn't just morally the right thing to do, but it's economically essential. Because all the evidence shows that the longer people are out of work, the more difficult it becomes for them to re-enter the labour market. So today, I will announce steps to ensure short-term job loss does not turn into a lifetime on benefits. Mr Deputy Speaker, the core of the government's approach is the Job Centre Plus network. Its help has almost halved the average time that people spend out of work compared to previous recessions. And even in the tough economic conditions since November, it has helped over 1 million people move back into new employment. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm determined that this support can continue to be given to people who lose their jobs. In November, I increased resources for the Job Centre Plus network and the New Deal by £1.3 billion. I can announce today an additional £1.7 billion worth of funding so that everyone can receive the high-level support and high-quality support to which they're entitled. Most people, even now, continue to find work within a matter of weeks. But we need to step up help to those who have greater difficulty in getting back into the labour market. So there will be additional support for people who have been out of work for 12 months through the flexible New Deal. I'm also determined that we do even more to protect young people from the damaging impact of long-term unemployment. The alternative is to return to the days when a whole generation of young people found themselves abandoned to a future on the scrap heap. We will not repeat that mistake. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want to offer a guarantee. From January, everyone under the age of 25 who's been out of work for 12 months will be offered a job or a place in training. Those in work will receive a wage, those in training will receive additional money on top of their benefits. And to provide these extra opportunities, we're working with employers to create or support as many as 250,000 jobs. And that will include delivering local services, traineeships in social care and other high-demand sectors, as well as jobs for people of all ages in particularly badly hit communities. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I also want to do more to help people gain the crucial skills that will be needed in the future. So as part of my guarantee to young people, I will spend over £260 million of new money for training and subsidies to help them get the skills or experience they need in sectors with strong future demand. We'll also provide extra investment to ensure that we deliver on our guarantee for every 16 and 17-year-old who wants to stay in education or training to make sure they can do so. And to deliver that, for the next 2 years, I'm providing a further £250 million this year and £400 million in 2010 and 11. And that will enable an additional 54,000 places in sixth forms and further education colleges for students in the next academic year. Mr. Deputy Speaker, for this and other measures, there will be consequential provisions where appropriate for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I'll shortly set out long-term measures for housing and for businesses to help build the recovery. But first, I want to set out how we can offer more support now in these areas. One of the biggest fears when people lose their jobs is that they and their families lose their homes. And I want to do more to reduce the number of repossessions. Last year, I increased and extended the support for mortgage interest schemes, which covers mortgage interest payments when people lose their jobs. Today, I can announce that I will maintain the higher level of support for a further 6 months to help homeowners as long as they look for a new job. This is in addition to the scheme to help people stay in their homes if their income falls. The housing market is also being held back by a lack of mortgage credit, and the government has taken action already to encourage an increase in mortgage lending, and this year the major UK banks will increase the availability of mortgages by around £20 billion. And to build on this, today I can announce the introduction, following state aid approval, of the scheme to guarantee securities backed by mortgages, which will help ease the flow of mortgage finance. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the recession and the credit crunch have made it much harder for people to take their first step on the housing ladder. And it's not just difficult for those involved, but it also undermines the entire housing market. So to help, I've decided to extend the stamp duty holiday on properties sold for less than £175,000 until the end of the year. 60% of residential properties will continue to be exempt, which will encourage modest and middle-income home buyers. I can also announce a further £80 million extension to the Home Buy Direct, the government shared equity mortgage scheme, which has already received interest from over 32,000 people since last September. Altogether, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is additional support for those who lose their jobs and new help for people to get onto the housing ladder. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in November, I announced a series of measures to help businesses now. Over 100,000 businesses, which employ well over 500,000 people, have taken up the option to defer their tax bills, and I intend to continue this help. Some 800,000 smaller companies will benefit from the delay in the increase in corporation tax. And last month, I announced that we would allow companies to spread out the payments of this year's uprating of business rates. But today, I want to do more to help firms with cash flow problems. Many viable companies face temporary difficulties because of the shortage of credit. So today I'm extending the help which allows loss-making companies to reclaim taxes on profits made in the last 3 years. And this help, which will lead on average to repayments worth £4,000 each year, will now be available for 2 years until November 2010. And well over 100,000 businesses will have their full current losses entirely wiped out. And today I could also announce additional targeted support for companies' cash flow with a top-up trade credit insurance scheme, which will match private sector trade credit insurance provision if insurers reduce their cover to businesses operating in the United Kingdom. I also want to help the UK's automotive industry, which has been one of Britain's success stories over the last decade, but the loss of consumer confidence and credit crunch has led to a sharp fall in vehicle sales around the world. So in order to help the car industry and retail trade, I can announce that we will implement a scrappage scheme next month. It will provide motorists with a £2,000 discount on new cars bought when they trade in cars over 10 years old. It will be a time-limited scheme till March 2010, and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Business, will announce further details shortly. Mr Deputy Speaker, we have made our choice to help those who have lost their jobs find work quickly and, if needed, to learn skills. We are acting decisively to prevent a new generation of young people becoming a lost generation, and we are offering real support to homeowners and to businesses through this unprecedented economic crisis. Mr Deputy Speaker, we could have decided to do nothing, but we chose to act because that is the right thing to do. And by doing so, Mr Deputy Speaker, we have not just protected people, but we will also reduce the length and the severity of this recession, lessening the impact on our public finances in the medium term. Mr Deputy Speaker, I now turn to the public finances and the action that I will take to put them on a sustainable footing in the medium and long term. As I told the House in November, tax revenues were falling. The financial sector, which provided 27% of corporation tax revenues, was already badly hit then. But since then, with the recession spreading across almost every sector, the wider tax take has also come down sharply. Corporation tax and income tax revenues have fallen. The problems in the housing market have meant that a dramatic reduction in stamp duty. In the UK, tax as a share of GDP is 1.2% percentage lower now than it was a year ago. And here and across the world, tax revenues are down and will take some years before they come back up. At the same time, our reform welfare state is rightly providing support for families, but of course it does come at an added cost to the Exchequer. Many countries have also intervened to strengthen their banking systems, as we have. And my public finances forecast today include a provisional estimate for the potential cost of this, which totals 3.5% of our GDP. Mr Deputy Speaker, around the world, fiscal deficits and government debt have been rising sharply to levels not seen since the Second World War. This is a response to an unprecedented financial crisis and a deep and widespread global recession. Allowing borrowing to rise, protecting services, helping people and businesses is the right thing to do. The alternative, to take money out of the economy now, as some have suggested, would damage key public services, it would create more unemployment, it would lengthen the downturn and lead in the end to higher, not lower debt. This government, as well as others, have learnt from the historic economic mistakes of the interwar period that countries cannot deflate their way out of recession. Mr Deputy Speaker, taken together, my budget measures today represent a fiscal easing of 0.5% of GDP this year, followed by a tightening of 0.8% of GDP each year until 2013-14. I believe this is a sensible pathway to sustainable public finances. It will mean, as I said, the budget deficit will be halved in the next 4 years. But at this stage, when there is so much uncertainty, To do so quicker would prevent us helping people now. It would, I believe, choke off recovery and stop us investing in the future. Now, many countries, as a result of their action to support the economy, have seen higher deficits. In the United States, for example, their Congressional Budget Office expects their deficit to be 13% of GDP in 2009, 10% in 2010, and even in 2019, the deficit will be above 5%. Our own figures for public sector net borrowing will be £175 billion this year, or some 12% of GDP. From 2010, as the economy starts to recover and the measures announced in November and today take effect, borrowing will fall to £173 billion, then 140, 118 and then £97 billion. And as a share of GDP, our borrowing will be 11.9% GDP next year, and then as we move towards balance, 9.1% in 2011-12, then 7.2%, then 5.5% in 2013-14. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this downturn will inevitably mean sharp increases in national debt relative to GDP. UK net debt, which includes the cost of stabilising the banking system, will, as a share of GDP, increase from 59% this year to 68% next, then 74% in 2011-12, 78% and then 79% in 2013-14. It will stabilise and then begin to fall from 2015-16. But in countries across the world, because of this economic crisis, it will take far longer for deficits to come back into balance. But because of the steps we are taking, I expect the underlying current budget to come back into balance 2 years later. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we need to help people now. We need to maintain key public services now. We need to invest in the future, but we also need to make sure that we maintain public finances on a sustainable footing. Indeed, this is the best way to drive up economic growth, which in turn is the best way to bring down borrowing and rebalance the public finances. But we must do this within a timescale that does not damage the recovery. Now, this will require tough decisions, but I'm determined they will be fair decisions. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it cannot be fair that those who should pay tax are allowed to avoid it. Over the last decade, we have taken a number of measures which have reduced tax evasion and avoidance, on average reducing avoidance by over £1 billion a year. And I intend to build on this today. We have identified loopholes and schemes which, when closed, will result in £1 billion of extra revenue over the next 3 years. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in this budget, there will be new measures to help pensioners and savers on middle and modest incomes. It is important that everyone is encouraged to save for their retirement, and we will continue to support them to do so. But I intend to address an anomaly which sees a tiny proportion at the top taking a large slice of the help we give people to help to save. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is difficult to justify how a quarter of all the money the country spends on pensions tax relief goes as now to the top 1.5% of earners. So from April 2011, I will restrict the pension tax relief for those with incomes over £150,000, so it is gradually tapered to the same 20% the majority of people receive. We will consult on its implementation, and I'm introducing measures from today to prevent forestalling. But again, only those with incomes over £150,000 will be affected. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am not proposing to increase taxes on income this year. However, as the economy recovers and wages start to grow again, it's right that we take additional steps. I believe that it is fair that those who have gained the most should contribute more. Only those with incomes over £100,000 a year, or 2% of the population, will be affected. In November, I announced a new rate of income tax of 45% on incomes above £150,000. That's the top 1% of taxpayers. In order to help pay for additional support for people now and to invest in the future, I've decided that the new rate will be 50% and will come in from April next year, a year earlier. In November, I also announced that I was reducing personal allowances from the very highest earners with incomes over 100,000. These allowances are worth twice as much as those of basic rate taxpayers, and I've now decided to fully withdraw the benefit of that allowance for those with incomes over £100,000 from next April. Mr Deputy Speaker, these measures are necessary to build our recovery and to secure our country's economic future. Along with other measures, including for landfill, company cars and gaming, I can also announce the following. I will continue to monitor oil prices, but I expect the fuel duty will increase by 2 pence per litre in September and then by 1 pence a litre above indexation each April for the next 4 years. Alcohol duties will go up by 2% from midnight tonight, and there will be an increase in tobacco duty of 2% from 6 o'clock this evening. Taken together, these measures will raise over £6 billion by 2012 to secure our economic future and to provide for help for people now when they need it most. Mr Deputy Speaker, the importance of our public services, on which we all depend, becomes even clearer in these difficult times. We have made our choice to continue investing in our public services, which underpin the health and strength of our nation now and in the future. In the last 10 years, this investment has seen an extra 40,000 doctors, 41,000 teachers and over 70,000 nurses. But just as every family is looking closely at their own budget to ensure they get the best value for money, so too should the government. Since 2004, the government has identified and made £26.5 billion in efficiency savings, whilst continuing to invest to improve schools and hospitals and other public services. In November, I announced plans to find an extra £5 billion of efficiency savings in 2010 and 11, on top of the £30 billion in this spending review period. Mr Deputy Speaker, some have argued we should cut public services immediately rather than invest and grow our way out of a recession. I believe that would be the wrong thing to do. And I can confirm that we are able to secure these savings that year whilst increasing investment as planned for local health services by over 5% and for schools by over 4%. Yesterday, we published the reports of the 5 independent reviews I set up last year, and they have identified extra efficiencies from 2011, which rise to a further £9 billion of additional savings a year by 2013-14. They include efficiencies in the public sector, back office functions and IT, improved procurement and better collaboration and innovation at a local level. And this, Mr Deputy Speaker, will allow us to protect frontline services whilst keeping current spending growth in real terms at an average of 0.7% a year from 2011-12 onwards. Mr Deputy Speaker, capital spending is equally important to the future of our country. Over the last 5 years, this investment has transformed services. There are 61 major hospital schemes, 140 new schools and improved transport links, including the modernisation of the West Coast Main Line. And it's essential to help create jobs, to boost the recovery and deliver economic success in the long term. I intend that capital investment will continue at historically high levels to 2012 as we prepare for the Olympic Games in Britain. And after this, public sector net investment will be 1.25% of GDP by 2013-14, twice as high as it was in 1997. Indeed, the efficiency savings we are making will help us direct more money to continue to support investment that everyone in this country depends upon. We have set ourselves a central goal of realising of up to £16 billion of property and other asset sales in the 3 years from 2011-12, with the proceeds raised being used for new capital investment. Mr Deputy Speaker, as a result of the measures I have announced today, I can afford to make further investment in the future of this country. These funds will be invested now to help ensure that we seize the opportunities that will come from a world economy that is expected to double in size. I've already announced today £3 billion worth of extra support to help people find work quickly and for the new guarantee for young people. There will also be £1 billion to help us combat climate change by supporting low-carbon industries and green-collar jobs. And there's close to £1 billion to help homeowners meet future housing supply and to allow the construction industry to recover quickly. and those £2.5 billion for business to encourage investment in industries and the high-paid, high-skilled jobs of the future. Sectors such as advanced manufacturing and the creative industries and the low-carbon technologies. They're all essential if we are to prepare for the future. Mr. Deputy Speaker, a successful economy needs a strong financial sector. We don't want to throw away the many advantages that come from our position as a world centre for finance. I intend that we retain that position. Hundreds of thousands of jobs across the United Kingdom depend on it. But we need to build trust in the banking system and harness the strengths of the financial services sector for the benefit of society. And crucial to that is financial regulation. Now, I'll publish shortly a Treasury paper with my recommendations for wide-ranging reform. They will propose action to reform corporate governance and remuneration at banks to avoid undue risk-taking, to improve the regulation of capital and liquidity so banks don't overextend themselves, and to increase transparency to achieve a single set of accounting rules so we can see the risks that banks are taking, as well as to regulate all important institutions, including hedge funds. It will also propose action to reduce the impact of the failure of financial firms. It will protect and support consumers, improve efficiency and competition in the financial markets, as well as strengthening the regulator's powers. And all these steps will in turn complement the agreement we reached in London earlier this month to restore trust in the global financial system. Mr. Deputy Speaker, strengthening the banking system is crucial to the recovery and to the economy. But the strength of our economy and the health of our society also depends on meeting the long-term demand for housing in this country. And I have two measures which will help achieve this. First, we want to work with the industry to help tackle the restraints which house builders say that could prevent them from acting now to increase housing supply. This will give construction firms more certainty and help them meet housing demand more effectively. Second, lack of finance now is affecting house builders and preventing the long-term investment that we need. So today, I can announce £500 million of extra financial support. This will kick-start building on housing projects which have been stalled because of the credit crunch and will deliver thousands of new homes. As part of that support, we are providing £100 million for local authorities to build new energy-efficient housing. And I have one further announcement to make about housing for one particular group. The whole country and the House is united in its admiration for the courage and professionalism of our armed forces. But I want to make sure that this admiration is reflected in the quality of their accommodation. So I'm bringing forward £50 million to accelerate the modernisation programme for this housing to ensure that this happens. Mr. Deputy Speaker, let me turn next to the targeted help for business, which will help build on the strengths of our economy. A sustained and strong recovery depends on companies of all sizes making the most of the new global opportunities that await them. More competitive exchange rate will help exporters. But it's also vital for our recovery that Britain and other countries remain open to free trade. And it's essential that the Export Credits Guarantee Department gives businesses the support they need. And I intend to report back shortly on how this support can be improved. I have a number of proposals, though, that will encourage investment. There is at the moment less incentive to explore and extract oil from the North Sea because of prevailing prices. So I'm bringing forward incentives to encourage smaller fields to be brought into production, which could lead to an extra 2 billion barrels of oil and gas that would otherwise remain under the North Sea. They will also remove the fiscal barriers so the North Sea can become a hub for energy for the future, gas storage, carbon capture and offshore wind. And I want to say something more about that shortly. But I want other industries to invest too. Businesses already benefit significantly from the annual £50,000 investment allowance which was announced 2 years ago. I want to go further to promote investment now. So for this year, I will double the main capital allowance to 40%. And this will encourage firms to bring forward investment, in particular those companies in the growth sectors that will deliver the rewarding jobs for the future. It will mean enhanced tax relief to support investment of up to £50 billion this year, and it will include £10 billion worth of investment in the vitally important communication sector. Mr Deputy Speaker, it's vital as well to ensure the entire country and economy benefits from the digital age. So I'm allocating extra funding for digital investment to help extend the broadband network to almost every community. And this will allow us to deliver the vision set out in the Digital Britain report, making sure that everyone can benefit from this communications revolution and create thousands of skilled jobs. Next, Mr Deputy Speaker, government can and should do more to buttress the strength and the capability we need for our economic future. On Monday, the government published a new industrial framework whose aim is to remove the barriers holding back innovative and fast-growing companies and to help markets work better. To support this industrial activity and strategy, I can announce the setting up of a £750 million investment fund to help the country seize the opportunities ahead. The new fund will provide financial support focusing on emerging technologies and regionally important sectors in, for example, advanced manufacturing, digital and biotechnology. And it will encourage export support, inward investment, it will promote research and development and harness commercially our world-class science base. And it will complement the 2 new city region pilots in Manchester and Leeds, which will also have a major role in promoting economic investment. Mr Deputy Speaker, green technology will be one of the great growth sectors in the world economy in the next few years. In preparing for the future, Britain's economic recovery must be sustainable and it must protect the environment. These efforts also have the potential to create thousands of high-tech businesses and hundreds of thousands of high-skilled jobs. Climate change is one of the biggest challenges our world faces, and we in Britain are setting the lead. We are ahead of every other major developed country in progress against our Kyoto targets. And today I'm presenting the world's first ever carbon budget, which commits this country to cut its carbon emissions by 34% by 2020. And these budgets will give industry the certainty needed to develop and use low-carbon technology, cutting emissions, creating new businesses and jobs. They are, Mr Deputy Speaker, a landmark step which will point the way to the vital decisions that must be made at Copenhagen at the Climate Change Summit later this year. Saving energy is the easiest and cheapest way to cut carbon emissions, and it also saves people and business money. Over the last 12 months, we've helped around 1 million homes improve central heating or insulation. So today, I can announce £435 million of extra support to develop energy efficiency measures for homes, businesses and public buildings. Mr Deputy Speaker, as well as saving energy, we need cleaner energy. And we must build on Britain's status as a world leader in offshore power generation. But I'm aware that the credit squeeze is holding back major offshore wind projects. I want to lift the barriers through £525 million of new financial support over the next 2 years for offshore wind, funded through the renewables obligation. The potential is enormous, and I'm confident this will lead to major projects getting the go-ahead quickly, providing enough electricity to meet the needs of up to 3 million households. We need to support all forms of support for renewable energy, and I can also support the renewable and other energy projects in the UK stand to benefit from up to £4 billion of new capital from the European Investment Bank. Mr Deputy Speaker, coal, oil and gas will continue to be a major source of energy for the foreseeable future. And clean technologies, such as carbon capture and storage, are vital to ensure we can produce power from these sources without damaging the environment. And I'm determined that this country's research and technological expertise is used to make us world leaders in this area as well. So I can announce the new funding mechanism will be used to finance at least 2 and up to 4 demonstration projects. Mr Deputy Speaker, the new generation of power plants could be even more efficient by using the heat produced in the generation of power. And to encourage the use of combined heat and power technology, I will exempt those projects from the climate change levy from 2013, which will bring forward over £2.5 billion worth of investment. I can also announce that through £405 million of new funding, we'll also encourage low-carbon energy and advanced green manufacturing in Britain to drive up the application of new technology, as well as to invest in small-scale projects. In particular, this will help us strengthen the supply chain right across these sectors and build on the expertise we have in this country. Mr Deputy Speaker, on the back of the discovery of oil and gas in the North Sea, we became a world leader in every aspect of oil technology and industry. And I am determined that we will replicate this success across renewable energy and low-carbon sectors. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, the steps we are taking today will help make sure we meet this ambition, and it will also protect our planet and ensure the country's economic future. The measures I have announced today, Mr Deputy Speaker, underline our vision of a confident and successful Britain. They offer support for people when they need it, but they also offer hope for the future. And they put in place the vital building blocks to recovery and the economic long-term success we need. And everything, Mr Deputy Speaker, we have done, whether it's supporting families now, maintaining investment in our public services and putting the nation's finances on a stable path, is based on our values of fairness and opportunity. And even at this time of global difficulty, we are determined to continue building a fairer society. Mr Deputy Speaker, in November, I provided help for families and pensioners, and today I want to do more. 22 million people on middle incomes have seen their income tax go down this month. There is help for millions of families too, with a child tax credit up by £75 this month and the increase in child benefit paid earlier. Today I can announce additional targeted measures. The Government is determined to eradicate child poverty, so first I can announce that from April next year, the child element of the child tax credit will increase by £20. Second, children with disabilities need extra help to make the most of their potential, so we will add an extra £100 a year to their child trust fund, and for those with severe disabilities, it will be an extra £200 each year. Third, I can announce an increase in the statutory redundancy pay from £350 to £380 a week. And, Mr Speaker, I have one further measure which will help a small number of valued people in this country. Increasingly, grandparents play a big role in family life in looking after their grandchildren. So to reflect this, we will, for the first time, ensure those people who have caring responsibilities for grandparents of working age that will count towards their entitlement to the basic state pension. I want also to announce further help for pensioners and for savers. Earlier this month, pensioners on modest incomes got the biggest ever increase in pension credit, while the basic state pension increased by £4.55 a week. And I want, Mr Deputy Speaker, to reaffirm today our commitment to increase the basic state pension by at least 2.5%. So if RPI inflation this September is below zero, as we expect, pensioners can be confident that their pensions will rise in real terms. Last year, because of the very steep increase in energy prices, I brought in a one-off increase in the winter fuel allowance. Energy prices are now expected to come down, but to help pensioners even more, I intend to maintain this allowance at the higher level for another year. And that is worth £250 for the over 60s and £400 for the over 80s. Mr Deputy Speaker, the fall in interest rates has been a welcome benefit to the economy and to millions of homeowners whose mortgage costs have come down. But this has also reduced the amount of interest paid out on savings and has particularly hit pensioners who rely on this extra money. There are over 5.5 million pensioner households in this country who have modest savings of less than £10,000, and I want to help them. For over a decade, the capital disregard on the pension credit has been at £6,000 or below. It means that savings above this level reduce the amount of help households get through the pension credit. I believe it's now time to increase these limits, which will help compensate modest-income pensioners with limited savings. So from November of this year, the limit will be raised to £10,000. That will benefit over 500,000 pensioners on modest incomes, who will gain by an average of £4 a week. Mr Deputy Speaker, I have one other announcement I want to make on savings. Tax-free ISAs have been a great success. 18 million people have taken them out, and they've saved in them almost £290 billion. Since they were introduced 10 years ago, the annual limit has only been increased once, and it now stands at £7,200. So I want to go further. So to help savers, on the 10th anniversary of ISAs, I intend to increase the total annual limits to £10,200, of which £5,100 can be saved in cash. And the new limit will be introduced this year for all those aged 50 or over, and it will come in next year for everyone else. So, Mr. Speaker, even in these difficult times, fair and targeted help for grandparents and children and to tackle child poverty, encouraging people to save now and in the future. Mr. Deputy Speaker, every country has been hit by this global recession, but we have confidence in Britain's future and in this country's strength. You can grow your way out of a recession, you can't cut your way out of it. We've made our choice to help people now to build Britain's future, and I commend this budget to the House.
Order. Order. Understanding Order number 51, the first motion entitled Provisional Collection of Taxes must be decided without debate. Will the Chancellor of the Exchequer please move formally? The question is that, pursuant to Section 5 of the Provisional Collection of Taxes Act 1968, provisional statutory effect should be given to the following motions. A. Rates of duty on alcoholic liquor, motion number 9. B. Rates of tobacco products duty, motion number 10. C. Fuel duties, rates and rebates from spring 2009, motion number 13. D. Amusement machine licences, amounts of duty, motion number 18. Gaming participation fees, motion number 61. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I shall now call upon the Chancellor of the Exchequer to move the motion entitled Amendment of the Law, and it is on this motion that the debate will take place today and on the succeeding days. The remaining motions will be put at the end of the budget debate next week. Will the Chancellor please move the Amendment of the Law motion? The question is that it is expedient to amend the law with respect to the national debt and the public revenue and to make further provision in connection with finance. 2. This resolution does not extend to the making of any amendment with respect to value-added tax so as to provide A, for zero rating or exempting a supply, acquisition or importation, B, for refunding an amount of tax, C, for any relief other than a relief that, so far as it is applicable to goods, applies to goods of every description, and so far as it is applicable to services, applies to services of every description. Mr. David Cameron.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, today everyone can see what an utter mess this Labour government and this Labour Prime Minister have made of the British economy. The fastest rise in unemployment in our history, the worst recession since World War II, and the worst peacetime public finances ever known. As of today, any claim they have ever made to economic competence is dead over finished. This Chancellor has just told us he will be doubling the national debt. He is planning to borrow £348 billion over the next 2 years. That is more, over just 2 years, than every previous government put together. Not just every government since World War II, not even every government since World War I. Every government since the Bank of England was first founded more than 300 years ago. This Prime Minister has certainly got himself in the history books. He has written a whole chapter in red ink, Labour's decade of debt. The Chancellor rattled through those figures for borrowing, so let me read them slowly. The government is set to borrow £175 billion this year, followed by £173 billion, then £140 You say you said it, you swallowed it. 100 and then 118 billion. That means that over a 4-year period, Britain will now be borrowing £606 billion. They talk about child poverty. With debt like that, our children are going to be in poverty for decades. It is a staggering amount, and the price will be paid not by the incompetent ministers who put us into this mess, but by families and businesses up and down our country. And I have to say, they will never forgive the people that have done this. Britain simply cannot afford another 5 years of Labour. And even these figures are massaged. If you look at page 204 of the Red Book, they are assuming that consumer demand is going to bounce back to pre-boom levels by 2011. That is what they're forecasting, and that's why they forecast the debt coming down as quickly as they do. This wouldn't be a U-shaped recovery, it'd be a trampoline recovery. And what is the Chancellor's excuse for these dreadful borrowing figures? Well, he just told us it's a world recession. Of course, other countries are suffering. But there's not one single other major country in the world in a position as bad as the United Kingdom. We have got, they say rubbish. There is not one country with a bigger budget deficit in any major economy. Why is that the case? Because they didn't fix the roof when the sun was shining. And it's no good. It's no good his pretending that these international factors were some sort of surprise. He knew there was a world recession when he made those utterly useless forecasts in the November pre-budget report last year. We now know what he told us was a complete work of fiction. Just take one figure, the growth forecast, which he told us was going to be -1%, he's had to downgrade to -3.5%. That is one of the biggest downgrades in the history of forecasting. These figures are so bad that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have had to do a spectacular U-turn. For years, they have lectured us that coming off the government spending programmes means swinging cuts. Minister after minister has stood at that dispatch box and said any attempt, any try to come off the government's rate of growth of spending means you're being savage or inhuman. And now they are doing it themselves. That is right. They have just... That's what they were all cheering in that rather pathetic cheer at the end of the budget speech. They've just announced over £10 billion of cuts over 2 years. Now, for years, this was the Prime Minister's great dividing line. This was his great... He's suddenly on the wrong side of his own dividing line. After today, no one will ever believe a word they say about spending cuts ever again. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this budget still doesn't do enough to get the public finances under control. In 2 words, it is completely inadequate. Instead of putting up taxes in 2011, why doesn't he get to grips with spending now and next year? And look at the... look at the consequences of failing to deal with spending. Look at the tax rises he's announced today. Now, of course, they claim it's just the rich that are going to pay. And by the way, he's just broken a manifesto promise not to put up the top rate of tax. But people expect that from this lot anyway. But look at the other taxes. Look at the tax on beer. That's going to hit every drinker in every pub. Look at the tax on petrol. They're reintroducing the fuel duty exercise. That is going to hit... Escalator. That is going to hit everyone who has to drive to work. These people aren't rich. These people have to work hard, and they're going to pay the price for Labour's failure. These aren't taxes for the few, they're taxes for the many, introduced by this Labour Prime Minister. But you know what stands out most about today's budget is how every single argument, every single prediction they have told us about has turned out to be wrong. They told us the recession would be less severe than the 1990s. I've lost count of the times the Prime Minister's told me over that dispatch box. Well, perhaps you'd like to look at page 200 of the Red Book, and I quote, "The current downturn is forecast to be much deeper than that of the early 1990s. Condemned by his own Red Book. This is worse than the 70s, this is worse than the 80s or the 90s. This isn't just boom and bust, it's the worst boom and bust ever." Then they told us in that November budget report that the recession would be over by the end of June. The Chancellor actually said in November, I don't know, he doesn't want to remember what he said in November, he said that growth would start early as a direct result of the cut in VAT. So by the government's own criteria, the VAT cut has failed. The money was wasted and our debt is higher as a result. Now, what about the last big argument? The one the Prime Minister tried to get off the ground before the G20. Britain, we were told, was heading for another great fiscal stimulus. Well, where is it? We're missing something. There isn't a fiscal stimulus here. There's a couple of extra billion added to what he'd already announced. This is less than the cut in next year's capital budget. This isn't a stimulus, it's a delayed tax rise and a delayed spending cut. He couldn't do a proper stimulus because he'd run out of money. He sits there shaking his head. He's the only person in Britain who doesn't realise how ridiculous he looked, wandering around the world telling governments everywhere else to open their chequebooks and start spending when the Governor of the Bank of England had taken his chequebook and torn it up in public. Now, of course we need schemes that will really help the unemployed and help British businesses large and small. We have been calling for a proper credit guarantee scheme for 6 months. But before we get carried away with the schemes announced today, I think we're entitled to ask what happened to the ones announced last year. The internship scheme, not working. The asset-backed security scheme, not working, but incidentally re-announced again today. What about Home Buy Direct? He told us about that today. Home Buy Direct was given another £80 million. What a treat for Home Buy Direct. Only one problem. We asked some parliamentary questions and found out by the 25th of March not a single sale had been made through the existing scheme. This is a fantastic. What about the homeowners' mortgage support scheme? Now, Peter Mandelson was meant to be in charge of that one. He knows a thing or two about getting a good mortgage. You think he might have succeeded? It was the centrepiece of the Queen's speech last year, and now, 4 months later, they've just announced it all over again. But still, not a single homeowner has received one single penny under this scheme. What a disgrace, what a callow farce from this government. And the Chancellor told us about his scrappage scheme. Let me see if I can get this right, the scrappage scheme. You take something 10 years old, completely clapped out, it pumps out hot air, pollutes its surrounding, it's absolutely ripe for the knacker's yard. What a brilliant idea! And where does this leave the Prime Minister's big argument, the one he based his whole premiership on, that he would always be prudent with the nation's finances? Barely a year ago, he described a deficit of 8% as being completely out of control. So what would he do to describe a deficit today of 11.9%? This is more than Dennis Healey borrowed when he was forced to go to the IMF. Let me turn to the IMF as well he might have to. I'd love to read out... I would love to read out a list of countries the IMF are saying are heading for a larger deficit than Britain next year. I can't. There aren't any. Russia, South Africa, Turkey, Argentina, they are all heading for deficits half the size of ours. Is it any wonder that in a not very noticed announcement, ministers chose this time to announce, some of you might have missed this, they announced they wanted to remove the stigma from countries going to the IMF. One minister actually said this. He said the IMF should be seen as something to celebrate. I'm not making this up, I promise. A bit like getting well-being care or going to a spa to recuperate. What planet are these people on? When are they going to realise they can't spin their way out of this one? This budget was a missed opportunity. We need to move from an economy of borrow and spend to an economy of save and invest. They talked about the disregard, but why not proper help in the tax system for people who save? Where was the plan to regulate the banks and regulate credit properly? Isn't it time to end the tripartite system and restore the Bank of England to its proper place of regulating debt in the economy? And on the fiscal side, he scrapped his fiscal rules, he scrapped his spending plans, but he's put absolutely nothing in their place. That's why we need spending restraint now and an Office of Budget Responsibility for the future. No one, I have to say to the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, no one will believe the government is going to sort out the public finances when the Prime Minister says they're only going to make serious start in 2011. We all saw what they're doing today. A few clever political taxes on the rich before the election, but save up anything in terms of real tax increases for 2011. But look what we've got between now and then. We've got another Queen's speech. There's another pre-budget report. There's another budget. The Prime Minister sits there in his bunker talking about all the brave things he's going to do in 2011. Isn't there anyone left to tell him he's got to hold an election between now and then? They just don't get it. They can't see what's actually wrong. He will never bring in the changes required because he doesn't accept that the economic model he's run for 12 years, based on government debt, consumer debt, housing debt, is fundamentally bust. This Prime Minister can never be the future because he doesn't understand what went wrong in the past. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the fundamental truth is that all Labour governments run out of money. The last Labour government gave us the winter of discontent. This Labour government has given us the decade of debt. The last Labour government left the dead unburied. This one leaves the debts unpaid. They sit there, running out of money, running out of moral authority, running out of time, and you have to ask yourself, what on earth is the point of another 14 months of this government of the living dead? If they don't have the courage, to deal with the debt and take the difficult decisions, why not make way for the team that can?
Order. Mr. Nick Clegg.
The economic crisis is unprecedented in many, many ways. Its scale, its speed, its reach. So people are looking for something bold and distinctive from this government. Think back to the great budgets of our history. The People's Budget of 1909, the first pension, the first social insurance. Labour's post-war budgets, building a new nation from the rubble of war. What made these budgets great was their ambition and their coherent vision for a different future. Now that is what we needed today, in the aftermath of this generation's disaster. The worst of times demands the best of budgets. So what did we get today? Today we got a mishmash of recycled announcements from a government skilled in raising false hopes, but incompetent in delivering practical help. The Chancellor had a choice. He could have used this budget to get practical help to the millions of people who really are struggling in this recession. He could have given a people's budget for the 21st century. Instead, we got just another politician's budget, desperately rushing around, picking up half-baked ideas to save the skin of this failing government. This budget is a political supermarket sweep, a trolley full of random promises without even a hint of a plan or any real likelihood that the promises are ever going to be put into practice. Mr. Speaker, the growth predictions in this budget also stoke up false hopes. The economy will grow, the Chancellor says, by 1.25% next year and 3.5% from 2011. £15 billion, he says, can be shaved from public spending without cancelling a single Whitehall project. Given the lamentable failure of this government to get its own predictions right, people will be asking what kind of fantasy world the Labour Party lives in these days. And if he gets the figures wrong again, particularly the growth predictions, there will be even greater pain necessary to get the government accounts in order in future years. Mr. Speaker, the economic crash is not the result of a few minor mistakes. Patchwork repairs won't fix it. We need to do things fundamentally differently. And though it barely warrants a mention in this budget, that will need to start with a different kind of banking system. Just because it's off the front pages today, it doesn't mean the problems in our banks are solved. Businesses still aren't getting loans. Banks are still in a mess. The problems have to be sorted. We need a banking system where no bank is too big to fail, where high street banks take no unnecessary risks with other people's money, and where risky casino investment banking is cut loose to fail when things go wrong. But, Mr. Speaker, the biggest disappointment of all in this budget today is its failure to sort out Britain's unfair tax system, to put money into people's pockets to help them make it through this recession. Britain's taxes are still too heavy on those who can least afford it and too easy to avoid for those who know how. That's how this government, and I think the Conservatives, seem to want it. We are now the only party who will do things differently and get practical help through lower taxes to people who are really struggling. This week we explained how it is possible, even in a recession, to cut most earners' income tax bills by £700 by raising the income tax threshold to £10,000 for everyone if we take aggressive action to clamp down on all the loopholes and exemptions that benefit the richest people and the biggest businesses. Now, the government today has finally accepted, having spent years telling us it's not possible, that one of the most unfair loopholes, the doubling of the tax relief on pension contributions from highest earners compared to people on ordinary incomes, should be changed. But they've only tinkered with the loophole today, removing the benefit only from the tiny minority of people earning more than £150,000. Like his other tokenistic measures apply to highest earners, it will raise very little money, according to his own Red Book, only £200 million, whilst leaving the really big loopholes, like the lower 18% tax on capital gains in place, which in effect serves as a massive subsidy for the very rich, when we should be doing everything we can to cut taxes for people who really need help. Our proposals would ensure that 4 million of the lowest paid no longer have to pay any income tax at all. Yeah. Our proposals would put fairness and transparency into this government's woefully unfair and complex tax system, and I urge the government, even at this late stage, to take our ideas up. Mr. Speaker, it isn't too late to sort out Labour's failed fiscal stimulus either. There should have been proposals in this budget to end the pointless VAT cut and replace it with a stimulus package that actually works. Billions have already been poured down the drain, but if the Chancellor stopped the VAT cut now, he would still have £8.5 billion to spend better elsewhere. Just imagine what could be done with that money, creating thousands of real jobs, as well as laying the foundations for a different, a greener economy, insulating 2 million homes and every school and hospital in the country, not the piffling amount that he announced today, building new council houses, upgrading public transport with new train carriages and reopening railway lines and railway stations. For every minute that goes by, £22,000 is wasted on that VAT cut. And every minute that goes by, someone else in Britain loses their job. It isn't too late to turn things around, cancel the VAT cut, put the money into green jobs, and we'll have a quicker recovery and a stronger country. Mr. Speaker, this mishmash budget includes a litany of missed opportunities. I welcome the announcement that the Chancellor has announced for pensions today, but will he confirm that he still hasn't addressed the fact that many pensioners receive pension credits on the absurd assumption that they're making a 10% return on their savings? Mr. Speaker, I've lost count of the number of government announcements on housing, yet we've got another one today. Yet fewer new affordable homes are being built than ever. Young people still can't get a foot on the housing ladder, and the government persists with its deeply misguided policy of subsidising people to take on new debt in a falling housing market. And then there's the huge dilemma, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of how balance and discipline could be restored to the government's finances in future. Today's figures of projected national debt will cast a dark shadow over future generations. But one thing is more important than anything else when it comes to the public finances: growth. Without growth, there will be no money anywhere to pay off the nation's debts. And that means we must not pull the rug out from under the British economy just as it's struggling to get up off the floor. So the Conservatives, I believe, are just plain wrong to propose slashing budgets immediately. It would be an act of monumental economic masochism. But the government is wrong too to commit right now to the biggest fiscal contraction in the OECD. According to its own figures published this morning, a massive 16.75% cut in capital investment, the government's own figures, by 2011, when they have no idea what the economy will look like by then. No idea whether cuts would kill off growth just as it's getting going. Remember, this time last year, the Chancellor said the economy would be growing by 2.5% today, and yet it's now 3.5% negative growth. 6 months ago, he said the recession would be over by July the 1st. Now, the Chancellor may fancy himself as the new mystic Meg, but he should get out of the predictions game. We don't know where the economy is going, so we simply must keep our options open until growth is restored, when we will need to face difficult choices. That's the only honest approach. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Chancellor should adopt an honest approach on spending too. He's trying to pretend that £15 billion could be stripped from public spending without anyone noticing. but talk of pain-free efficiency savings are a joke. We all remember Gershon. All it proved is you can move money from one column to another and call it a saving. The Liberal Democrats would do things differently. We would take big choices about what government should and shouldn't do in the medium term once growth has kicked in again, asking difficult questions. Is the 50% target for university students either necessary or affordable? What is our international military role and how much should we spend on it? Are exceedingly generous pension entitlements for well-paid public servants fair or affordable? We need a national debate about what the state can and cannot afford in the future, not Whitehall salami slicing today. That is the responsible way, the honest way, to reduce spending in the years ahead and avoid painful higher taxes. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this budget could have been a great budget. It could have set a new direction, a new course for Britain, out of recession and towards a stronger future. A new, fair, transparent tax regime, a better banking system, green jobs, green infrastructure for a sustainable economic future. A new era of openness from government about what the public purse can sustain. A new era of responsible, lean government that improves people's lives. Today was an opportunity to deliver practical help. But Labour is out of ideas, out of steam. Today they have condemned us to years of unemployment and decades of debt. The country deserves something different.
The John McFall.